Alright, so I've edited in this quick little beginner video before getting into the real video. Tonight, as I was just cruising through my subscriptions, fellow YouTuber and fellow Canadian soldier and veteran Matsimus, I'll link his channel in the description down below, put out a tearful goodbye to his best friend, Tank, his dog, which he had to put down this evening. So, Matsimus, I know we don't know each other personally, brother, but from one soldier to another, I'm praying for you, and if you need anything, man, just ask, alright? So with that, my respects to you and to Tank. Hope he crosses the rainbow bridge in peace with someone he loves. I know he did, so with that, buddy, best of luck. And to everyone else, let's get into this. The UN, or United Nations, from the Expanse TV series In Universe. We'll start by explaining the UN in its universe, its history, voting system, and its population, a lot of its flaws, and we'll do mild comparisons to UN of current day and current universe. So with that, we will carry on. So, let's start with the history of the UN in universe. Now, the UN shares its common ancestry with UN of our universe, founded in 1945 after World War II, and those things. Things begin to delineate current year when climate change begins to get progressively worse, and eventually the UN and all the sovereign nations of Earth eventually will cede sovereignty to the UN, later in the 21st, 22nd century in universe. So, after all the nations of Earth, after climate change, ceded to the UN began administrating space travel and began pushing out into space. Permanent settlements were established on Mars and Luna. Several settlements began in the asteroid belt. And this sort of began when Earth still had various nation states, but the UN controlled all logistics for space travel at the time. So, basically, fast forward a bunch of years, everything's still crapping out, and at least with the ecosystem, UN begins to focus on this more than anything, and attempts to unify humanity to basically stem the tide of the damage they've done to Earth in this universe. Later on, it'd be revealed that Mars was actually, in fact, that Earth managed to stem the worst of the change of climate change in its universe through their terraforming technology. So that'll be something to explore in the next video with the MCRN. So that's a brief history of the UN's rise to power in the solar system. So after they'd established the colonies, Mars eventually began to agitate for independence. It was granted after they gave the technology for the Epstein drive, which allows for super fast but not superluminal travel. Basically, it's in a linear acceleration drive that allows the ships to travel at a constant acceleration, producing thrust gravity while being super fuel efficient. It's just a MacGuffin in the series to allow for the travel of the great distances while maintaining scientific realism. When you look into it, it's actually a really neat system. So, the UN's capital and fleet headquarters is maintained in New York City, the most populous city on the planet at this point. You can see that it's surrounded by huge walls, given its coastal status. Again, the effects of climate change are apparent because the water is up. It would be probably to the 5th to the 10th floors of a lot of these buildings if that wall wasn't there. And, well, it's New York, so no big loss. But I suppose for in-universe it makes sense. After the UN managed to get control of the planet, it broke it up into several shared interest zones. Now, the borders for these don't in any way really resemble any sort of economic, cultural, or even ethnic borders of today, or any borders that would make any logical sense in reality. But these zones apparently vote for the representatives, for the representative democracy of the UN, which is a highly stratified society in itself, which will become apparent a little bit later on. So they vote for these members out of these shared interest zones. However, the pools of candidates are rather limited, and you'll see again where the corruption really takes hold when we start discussing the population. So the generalized government of the UN in this universe is supposed to be a representative constitutional republic. Now, it's often they say that, but the portrayal is largely different. It seems to be more of a benign dictatorship as opposed to an actual representative democracy or a constitutional republic. As the citizens, if they don't belong to a specific class, have their restrictions pretty much largely stacked against them. They can't leave certain areas, they're restricted to certain incomes, jobs, etc. But we'll discuss that later. The head of state of the government will be the Secretary General, who is elected by the executive branch of the United Nations Security Council, who in turn is elected by the legislative branch, the United Nations General Assembly. The courts are controlled by the Court of Justice, and the military branch of the UN is the United Nations Navy, or UNN, and the United Nations Marine Corps, the UNMC. Now, given the massive bloat of this system, it's got a massive runaway bureaucracy problem. The bureaucracy in the UN government is huge, as even evidenced by one group voting in the next group, which votes in the next group. Now, all of these groups have got their own undersecretaries, which report to their own divisions, and you can see how this just spirals out of control. It actually sounds quite similar to how the UN of today is currently run, where there are so many legislative bodies, nobody can get anything done. If you've ever watched the UN session, to quote, can't remember that comedian's name, but he said, if you ever watch the session of the UN on TV, it would make you want to prescribe Ritalin to a glacier. Now, here's where we're going to start discussing population. Now, there are 31 billion people in the United Nations as of the events of the Expanse. An additional 15 billion living extraterrestrial under control of the UN. So, this is a rather large, ridiculous number of population. You can see where this goes. All right. Now, they have what they call a sort of universal basic income, or BASIC. Now, for all intents and purposes, this is state-sponsored, addictive, abject poverty. You are given the basics, literally. Food, recycled paper clothing, and basic shelter. People have to live communally in large areas. Access to clean water is largely restricted. You've got restrictions on travel. You cannot leave the slums or the areas that are basic zones. There are huge restrictions. The only way you can get out of basic is either through job or the education and employment lotteries, or to be sponsored by someone through the apprenticeship programs. So there are some ways for upward mobility, but it is massively competitive. As you can see, a huge population pool, 31 billion and another 15 billion on top of that. So you got 46 billion people vying for maybe 10% of that's worth of jobs. So you can see where 2/3 of the population actually lives on basic, because there aren't enough opportunities to go around. When a population reaches this size, doesn't matter how good your government is, you're not going to have enough jobs to go around. So again, this is where the benign dictatorship kicks in, and you can see that they would restrict the travel and basically force them to become government dependents. Because if you can keep them on government dependence, you don't have them agitating for additional freedoms and whatnot. A lot of their civil liberties are largely truncated. You can see that all protests are often met with violence and oppression from the government. There are several instances in the series where you can see protests during the war between Earth and Mars that are being put down by MPs. And the UN military is primarily used as a tool of oppression for the belt, and to keep trying to impose its will over Mars, which is an independent state and a military superpower on parity with the United Nations Navy. Now, here's where things take a sudden and dire spiral down the rabbit hole of just plain weird. And in universe, I guess it would make sense, but as you can see, there are certain parallels to what's already happening in today's society. The cost of children is so prohibitively expensive due to baby taxes that even the richest people can only afford to have 1 or 2 children. People on basic cannot afford to, so large groups of people have to form multi-genetic family units to share the burden of raising just a single child. The titular character in the series, James Holden, I believe has 4 fathers and 3 mothers, or the other way around, 3 fathers, 4 mothers. But he's a multi-gene child. And another way to get out of this is also to join the military. The military will provide you with certain opportunities. If you manage to rise up in the ranks, you can presumably make it easier for yourself to raise children or have families, although the families are never large due to massive overpopulation problems. Now, the stratified society portion of the UN becomes glaringly obvious during this. As you can see, the people on Basic are living literally in squalor. It's described in Season 3 that when one of the characters on Basic begins to trade with Staff Sergeant Bobby Draper, Gunnery Sergeant Bobby Draper, for her drugs, so a Martian can basically survive on Earth with little to no medical problems. They trade the drugs to prevent cholera in the future when they have to drink toilet water and sewer water in the summer due to a lack of clean drinking water. So even though that their people are on abject poverty and forced government welfare, you can't escape it because all children are registered at birth and so forth. So it's a society that has very large controls over its population and considerable control over its movement, its associations. Again, this doesn't sound anything like a representative democracy. It sounds more like a benign dictatorship, where the boot heel is you will not get your basic substance if you do not comply. So this sounds again similar to the concept of the universal basic income, and quite frankly, this is the end game conclusion of any universal basic income program that makes its way into society. You disincentivize actually having to work by providing basic government necessities and or money, and people aren't going to want to work. Despite all the best intentions, people are inherently lazy and will take the path of least resistance. Doesn't matter how altruistic and how much faith you have in humanity, we're all lazy. I can tell you with absolute certainty, even myself, if the government were willing to pay my basic needs, and I could sit around all day and lounge on my ass and then do whatever the hell I want, I'd be pretty tempted to take it. And I doubt anyone who says that they wouldn't is either a completely driven psychopath who's a workaholic, and to which case I salute you, or, someone who is lying to themselves, because quite frankly, given the chance to put down our tools and rest, we would do so. So again, through the exploring the concept of basic and the restrictions that have to be placed on people on basic, you can see where the concept of the universal basic income is just a completely untenable idea based on human nature alone. It's the same principle as communism. Yeah, it works on paper, but it doesn't work in reality because people are greedy, lazy, manipulative, and quite frankly, self-interest governs all when it comes to people given half a chance. Not everybody. There are good people out there, don't get me wrong. I'm not disparaging the whole human race, and especially not the human race of Earth. I live here. I like this place. It's a good place. I like most of the people on it too. But you can see whereas if you supply people with the, absolute base, path of least resistance, things will quickly spiral out of control into an epidemic of laziness. And as that laziness spirals, the curtailments on the basic become more and more apparent as the more and more people require it. There's just simply not enough opportunity to go around. It's a finite universe, there's finite resources, and a government like this would have to be very, very prudent in how they decide to spend said resources given the large population and the large bureaucratic mess required to take care of said populations. So, the final part to this is the overall oppressive nature of the UN, not through its banality with its own citizens, but to its colonies as well. Ceres is a protectorate of Earth and the UNN, and also has the same problems with its belter populations and how it oppresses them. The Rich, stratified individuals live in the best parts of Ceres, whereas the workers and people on basic and homeless are left living to the slums. So, again, you can see that. Mars, they held under the boot heel until they had the chance to trade for their independence. The belt is still largely under control of the UN, as well as several colonies in the outer planets, and several moons. Titania and Titan, as well as Ganymede, are both under control of the United Nations as well. So their reach is quite distant, but it's basically more grab for resources. Ganymede is used as a farm, so it is the breadbasket of the belt. Europa is where they grow all the meats in vats and farms. And a lot of the resource plants are all out on the other moons. So you can see where the drive for resources has led to expansion, and the only way the UN's economy can actually function is through colonial behavior. Which is absolutely ironic, given the UN's constant haranguing of everybody about their colonial past, and the only way they can survive in this universe is to become colonial themselves. So the irony is not lost on us. So let's take a quick look back here and make a quick comparison and a final conclusion to this, now that we have a bit of a background on the UN in the Expanse. So they claim to be representative democracy. We can see by their demonstrable behavior and their setup that they are, on the surface at best, on paper, I suppose, a representative democracy, but overall it is benign dictatorship and autocracy and highly stratified society with a extremely limited suffrage and next to no upward mobility for the vast majority of its citizens. In our world, the UN, also a bureaucratic mess, largely inept, not oppressive yet, but attempting to be through legislation, forced resolutions, attempted usurpations of democracies with their resolutions, and overall, at least they don't have a standing army to their own. Their armies are composed of volunteer nations who can withdraw their troops at any time. At least for now, there's stopgaps and stops and checks in places, but we can quickly see how an organization like the UN can quickly spiral out of control and become the oppressive machine that everyone fears. In all honesty, despite the rosy portrayal of their propaganda, it's almost like the UN in this series was written by, basically, I would have to say, like, if I had to compare it to someone, I would say, like, those Oath Keeper 3%er types that are super patriotic and go, if the UN ever shows up my soil, it'll be blue helmet shot everywhere. It almost reads like it was written like this. They've almost comically portrayed the expansion and the extremism that the government has to go to maintain control over its own population. And a lot of the UN's social policies in this have resulted in the basically dissolution of traditional, I would say, traditional pillars of society that we take for granted largely today, like the traditional families and upward mobility, the ability to move around, like no restrictions on travel, freedom of association and thought. A lot of this has been stripped away. Even the right to protest seems to be largely curtailed in the UN's universe in this show, which is frightening because given any chance, any one national government with no checks and balances will again become an oppressive society. We can even see that happen today. Single-party governments become oppressive societies all the time today. North Korea, China, the list goes on and on and on. There are plenty of theocratic societies. And simply grouping them together in one unified government is just going to pool all of that ill will, all of that evil into one place and just cause it to explode and move into the absolute extreme of the spectrum. And we don't want that. A system like this could never work in reality. Because unfortunately, as lazy as humans can be, we also value our freedom. We also value our ability to move around, our rights to association and thought. Babylon 5, Jakar, the character in Babylon 5, said it best, that no government, no army, and no oppressive regime can hold a population by force of arms alone. The cry for freedom is too strong, and the will to be free is unbreakable. And against that, no tyrant, no government can stand. So with those words, I'll leave you with the fact that even though that our UN and the UN in the universe of the Expanse are very similar in a lot of ways, and given half a chance, the UN in our universe would quickly take on this role, even in this capacity, and they're attempting to now. A lot of the sustainability projects, Agenda 21 and all these things, without sounding like a conspiracy nut, if you even go read it, they want to force the vast majority of populations to cities for control. It states very plain as day in Agenda 21 and the sustainability indexes in the UN's own website. It's terrifying stuff, and the Expanse shows you exactly what can happen if this allows to happen unchecked. 2/3 of 46 billion people on government welfare, unable to travel, unable to get upward mobility, reliant on the state. You know, having to basically drink sewer water or die, not having children, the destruction of the family unit. These are things that free-thinking and moral people can't countenance. So, with that, we've explored the UN and the Expanse. Tomorrow, we're going to explore the Mars Congressional Republic, or as I call it, American exceptionalism in the 50s in space. So with that, guys, I hope this has been an informational video to you, giving you something to think about. If you want to see more content like this, please like and subscribe, and by all means, let's have a conversation in the comments section. So, have a good one, guys. Peace out. Love each other and love yourselves.